An interesting one for you here today. Ace 1918 uh, is responding to a recent claim, both in the Warhammer community and apparently by a YouTuber, that Warhammer has a national socialist problem. Now, I'm going to go ahead and give them the benefit of the doubt and claim that they are using National Socialist not to indicate that uh, not to do what a lot of fascists and Nazis do and try to tar socialists with association with the Nazis. Although that may be a part of it, but simply because YouTube's been cracking down on Nazis on their YouTube, which, hey, good, fuck Nazis. But responding to Warhammer's National Socialist problem. Now, I've never played Warhammer. I haven't played any of the video games related to it, but I have been in the nerd space long enough that I've absorbed some bits of the lore. I basically had a choice between one money-draining hobby, and I chose Magic the Gathering. And I think I made the right choice. But let's see what this Ace 1918 has to say about Warhammer's National Socialist problem. So, Ace, take it away. Skip.
A much smaller channel called Salamander, and their video, which I will refer to as Warhammer's National Socialist Problem. Now granted, this is a tiny video and tiny channel, even in comparison to, for example, my own. However, what is interesting and telling to note is that this is also the largest channel and video that is actually critical of Arch in the whole trademark issue as well. Now I could go through and react to every single thing wrong within this 15-minute long video, however, for the sake of brevity, here's a summary of the points he makes. Salamander argues that the Imperium of Man within the Warhammer 40k universe is inherently fascist, and that the, quote, fascism of the Imperium of Man has in the past been justified by the lore as being a, quote, necessary evil. He also argues that as a result of this, that the Warhammer 40k community has therefore attracted real-life National Socialists and supremacists. And he even suggests that Games Workshop has been trying to go woke for quite a while, and uses the introduction of the Tau as an example of such an attempt. Naturally, he also comes to the conclusion that Games Workshop needs to continue going woke and attempting to rid itself of the so-called problematic elements of its fanbase, and
So yeah, from what I've read, what I've heard from other people who are involved in the Warhammer community, yeah, the Imperium of Man is explicitly a fascist, all but explicitly a fascist organization. It is ruled allegedly by a by an emperor who is locked inside some sort of mechanical throne and is allegedly supposed to be dead. There is no questioning of the emperor. The emperor's rule is law, and the Imperium is very imperialistic, seeking to spread their rule throughout the universe of Warhammer 40k. And given that they are the human analog in Warhammer 40k, this has attracted a lot of people who are attracted to authoritarianism. And most people will agree that the Imperium Man is at least authoritarian. But they're also very human supremacist. So, and given that most depictions of Imperium depict white people, it tends to attract white supremacists to the games. Now, Games Workshop has done, as Ace mentioned here, done some work to mitigate that, both by doing things to show the negative aspects of the Imperium, but also by introducing non-white human characters into the world, characters who are explicitly, and some other stuff like talking about how I think the Adepticus Mechanicus doesn't have gender. There's no, because these are people who the Adepticus Mechanicus, basically you're born and are immediately grafted into a set of infant power armor, and as you grow, you get new sets of power armor because that's how they roll. Better living through technology, completely ignoring the differences in the meat underneath.
Finally, and of course to the surprise of absolutely no one, he comes to the conclusion that Arch is a National Socialist, although the exact term that he technically uses is reactionary. So with all of that said, what are the problems?
Yeah, Arch Warhammer is definitely some flavor of fascist. Absolutely, yeah, no question. His support of a number of things. I haven't watched too much Arch Warhammer, but I've watched enough that I've definitely gotten that feeling from him. So yeah, unquestionably.
Problems with the arguments that have been made.
Also, he's just a fucking pretentious prick. Arch Warhammer talks like this, despite being Norwegian, throughout the entire video. It's pretentious as fuck, but pretension does not equal fascism.
In this video? Well, for a start, he assumes that the Imperium of Man can be considered fascist, and unfortunately for him, that is simply not the case. In fact, Arch himself actually did a fantastic video on this specific topic back in December of last year, where he thoroughly went
Holy shit, an hour-long video.
through what exactly
I say with regular hour-and-a-half long videos on my channel.
fascism was and was not, looking at multiple different definitions and various sources to back his ultimate conclusion. Basically, the bare-bones definition for fascism can be described as everything within the state, nothing outside the state, and nothing against the state. And it should also be noted that the Imperium of...
That's a pretty decent bare-bones definition of fascism, although it ignores the in-group supremacist notions that also accompany fascism. But yeah, the fascism is basically that the state rules all, and you can't go against the state. Yeah, pretty good definition.
Of Man does not meet the standards for what is a fascist state in all three of these categories. Instead, the Imperium can be far better described as a feudal theocratic society. So it is a very inaccurate statement to claim that the Imperium of Man is fascist, but it's also, of course, therefore inaccurate to also claim that the so-called fascism of the Imperium is justified within the lore of Warhammer 40k. There is
If it's a feudal theocratic, the difference between feudalism and fascism is that feudalism has explicit hierarchies and castes, whereas fascism doesn't necessarily have the same kind of hierarchies. There's still definitely a hierarchy to fascism, but it's usually more of a in-group, out-group hierarchy or bureaucracy within the government of the state. So to say that this would be like saying that's not a dog, it's a Doberman Pinscher. That's a little reductive, but you're using different words to describe basically the same thing.
is, however, one thing that is being justified in the lore, and that is the authoritarian stance that the Imperium possesses. But of course, this is far from unique to fascism as an ideology, and quite ironically enough, despite Salamander's wishes with his video, he ultimately calls for authoritarianism in the end on the part of Games Workshop, in their effort to essentially silence people that they do not politically agree with. Now, of course,
Tolerance of intolerance paradox. Yes, if you want to maintain a diverse liberal society, liberal in the classic Enlightenment sense, you have to be intolerant of those who wish to rob other people of liberty. So what he's calling, he's claiming to call for authoritarianism because apparently the salamander called for uh, um, Games Workshop to step in and disavow or even excommunicate fascists and Nazis from their community, which I agree with wholeheartedly. Because the problem is, and again, the tolerance of intolerance paradox. If you don't, if you don't excise intolerant people, racists, sexists, bigots of all stripes, from your community, then your community inevitably becomes overtaken by and controlled by bigots, racists, what have you. You can just look at places like DLive and BitChute, which pride themselves on being bastions of free speech, of having no no enforcement against hate speech, or nobody gets banned there for calls for violence. Well, I think they can get banned for calls of violence, but they don't have the strict TOS enforcement that places like Twitch or YouTube do. And what have those places turned into? Well, there are a few decent people on BitChute and DLive. They are bastions of Nazis and racists. Because if Nazis and racists don't get shut down, then they push the people they're bigoted against out of the community. So this is why good people who enjoy Warhammer are calling to push Nazis and fascists and racists out of the Warhammer community, because the more these people exist in the community, the more the fewer the less diversity you will experience in the Warhammer community, because they'll push out black people, they'll push out gay people, they'll push out socialists, they'll push out any kind of person who disagrees with their rhetoric. Now, you can have individual conclaves of fans of something which are diverse, because either the people running them are aware of the tolerance of intolerance paradox, and they work to keep these bigots out, or just accidentally don't attract any bigots. But when we're talking about something as big as Warhammer, and it's probably one of the biggest fantasy slash science fiction fandoms in nerddom today, that you can't rely on individual groups to police themselves that way. This is why I did a video. Actually, I did a video by Arch Warhammer here a little while ago about Games Workshop talking about how they didn't want any racists or sexists or homophobes or transphobes in their community. That was them accepting that they needed to do something to make sure that the community was safe for as many people as possible. And Arch Warhammer himself was saying that this was them being discriminatory against some people when before it was open to everyone. Which it technically was, but Warhammer has a bad reputation as being full of Nazis, being full of bigots, being the kind of um, community that would make gender or sexual nonconforming people or black people or people, non-white people, and women of all stripes uncomfortable. And that is something you have to deal with if you want to have. I mean, this was the theory behind capitalism when it first was created by Adam Smith, was that capitalists wouldn't discriminate against customers because then they would lose money. Well, turns out they could figure out ways to make money even with discrimination, but it's still an issue that they need to work with.
Of course, should Salamander actually watch this particular video and try to respond to it, he may try to point out that the Imperium of Man is xenophobic, and that this somehow demonstrates that it is indeed fascist.
Yes, xenophobia is a major aspect of fascism. And from what I understand, the Imperium of Man is very xenophobic.
May perhaps even do it as a means of differentiating the authoritarianism that he wants to have done in comparison to the fictional authoritarianism within the Imperium of Man. However, here comes the part that Salamander might find quite uncomfortable to hear, or indeed anyone else that hails from the Sigmarxism Reddit page. And this is the fact that the fascism and National Socialism that Sigmarxism and indeed Salamander is against are both at their very core Marxist ideologies. But
there it is! Marxism is authoritarianism. Yep. No. No, my dude. Socialism is inherently at its core an egalitarian ideology. Just because it has been co-opted and misused for authoritarian regimes doesn't mean that it's inherently authoritarian. You're just wrong here.
Home best, we need to go back to the Arch video on whether or not the Imperium of Man is fascist, and listen to a very specific quote that is read by Sargon of Akkad in that video.
Is the reason why fascism rose to power in the first place. In a time of revolutionary ideals sweeping through Europe, the socialists had promised revolution time and time again, but never delivered. In the words of ye old Adolf,
I have learned a great deal from Marxism, as I do not hesitate to admit. The difference between them and myself is that I have really put into practice what these peddlers and pen pushers have timidly begun. The whole of National Socialism is based on it. National Socialism is what Marxism might have been if it could have broken its absurd and artificial ties with a democratic order.
Holy shit! Democracy is the core of socialism. The whole idea of socialism is democratizing the economy to make it work for everyone. This is fucking absurd. Marxism is not authoritarian by nature. Marxist-Leninism is, but that's a whole other story. So to claim that the Sig Warhammer, whatever the fucking, what do they call it? Sig Marxism, yeah. To claim that Marxism is authoritarian is just absurd. It's not authoritarian to call for the excisement of people who hate for no reason, for people who want to destroy people based on inherent parts of their identity which they cannot control. That's not authoritarianism. That's egalitarianism.
So as we can see here, even National Socialism itself is built upon Marxist ideals.
It's really not. It's based on a perversion of Marxist ideals in order to appeal to a working class which had been left behind and marginalized by the effects, particularly in Germany, of World War I. National Socialism has nothing to do with socialism or communism or Marxism. It's a perversion, a co-option a co-opting of terms and phrases in order to appeal to a broader base. That is fascism.
And can easily be described as a form of Marxism in its own right. A notion that I am sure doesn't exactly please the Marxists of Sigmarxism. But unfortunately for them, this isn't exactly where the connections between the two ideologies end. As those of you who have already seen my Dungeons & Dragons and Diversity video will already know, I had actually stumbled across examples of the Sigmarxism community coming to the conclusion that the Skaven and Chaos Dwarves from Warhammer Fantasy are supposed to be anti-Semitic depictions of the Jews, even flat out citing National Socialist propaganda as one of the big reasons why the Star of David was the first thought that popped into their minds when they first saw this.
Okay, so as much as I've been enjoying the Skaven equals ANCAP meme, it struck me yesterday how they could be construed as an even more worse anti-Semitic stereotype. The caricature of Jewish features as rat-like was used by True. They portrayed weak and grotesque creatures who nonetheless run a sprawling underground empire directly under the noses of the Aryan protagonists of the setting. Their subhumans ghettoized beneath the cities of the upstanding human empires, plotting the destruction of the world as we know it through alliance with the marginalized elements of society. Yup. They are greedy, short-sighted, and murderous, thinking nothing of killing their own. My crazy are Skaven a completely over-the-top anti-Semitic stereotype, and if they are, how do we deal with that? Yep. That sounds like some Nazi Jewish propaganda to me.
Skaven. And this right here is one of the major problems that individuals such as myself and many others have with the ideology of social justice. Because this appears to be a great example of social justice as an ideology actively promoting and building up bigotry rather than tearing it down as intended. No one of sane mind would look at the Skaven and think of the Jews. But the fact that it's an idea that is so easily accepted within the Sigmarxist community shows that perhaps they are in fact the ones with the problem in the Warhammer community. Now for those of you who are curious and want to know why...
What? Holy shit, dude. The whole point of that was that there are certain aspects which bear a striking similarity to the way Jews are portrayed, particularly in Nazi propaganda. If you can't see that, then that means either you think it's not propaganda or you're not familiar with Nazi propaganda. That's like there's actually an issue with a lot of, especially older RPG systems, which tend to have a lot of negative anti-Semitic, I guess that's kind of redundant, negative Semitic stereotypes built into certain races. I've talked before about how in early editions of Shadowrun, the dwarves were very Semitic in their portrayal. They were very insular. They tended to work together only with their own kind. They were very greedy, very concerned about obtaining wealth and hoarding it. And they kind of look a little Semitic with the big noses and the beards and whatnot. So now, whether this is a Nazi deliberately doing this, or whether it's someone carelessly building on accepted tropes, that's something I'm not going to speculate on, either for Shadowrun or for the Skaven. A lot of people have made similar remarks about the oh, Dave, help me out here. The Star Trek race, who basically are a bunch of traitors. Oh God! As soon as I hear the name, I'll know it. Ferengi, yes, thank you. There's been a lot of talk about the Ferengi being Jewish or Semitic stereotype in a lot of talk about Star Trek. And Star Trek was basically created by a fucking socialist, so, you know, it's not something that even progressive people are immune to. Which is why you have to be careful, especially if someone points it out, to make sure that you change it. Which is why I'm sure there will be Skaven who break this Semitic mold. And why the Shadowrun has done work to break the Semitic stereotypes around dwarves in recent editions. Because just because something appears a certain way, especially at its inception, doesn't mean that's A, how it was intended, or B, how it has to be for all time. But ignoring these tropes lets people use them for their own dog whistles, which is why pointing out that the Skaven may be Semitic stereotypes means that either there is a Nazi in charge of helping to create races at Games Workshop, or the people who create the races in Games Workshop are a little out of touch. And in either case, bringing attention to it will help to fix it. Because either they root out the Nazis, or they realize it and correct it.
Stuff like this tends to happen within the ideology of social justice. Well, here's my reasoning. First of all, it's important to note that social justice as an ideology demands that everything be viewed as political. And just as importantly,
everything is political, you fuckwad. Literally, everything is political. This game right here that you're playing, well, I guess, is political because it's promoting the idea of going around and destroying things for gain. That's a cloaked form of imperialism. Everything is political.
As trying to push an agenda. Now, I've actually already done numerous videos discussing the origin of this mindset and debunking it, at least within the realm of video games. But it is a very important one to keep in mind when understanding the SJW's mindset, because it outright demands that they actively try to look for the so-called politics in anything and everything that's an art form, regardless of whether or not the political messages actually exist in the first place. This, of course, leads to examples such as the aforementioned suggestion that the Imperium of Man is fascist, when, as thanks to art, we've already determined it is clearly not.
Only electoralism is politics is a very modern neoliberal idea. It's a way that they can keep people ignorant of the changes around them and keep people complacent in their place so that they don't try to change things significantly. Everything, especially art, is political. Some are more political than others. Something I want to do is to talk about the politics of individual video games and how they reinforce certain ideas in society by people with the people who play them.
The second issue is that for SJWs to effectively determine if something is problematic or playing off stereotypes, they have to be effectively taught by members of the ideology what those stereotypes are, as well as, of course, how to find them. This may seem harmless at first, but what it ultimately means is that social justice as an ideology ultimately requires that its members be trained to be able to think and view the world the same way as racists do. And combining this mindset with the aforementioned notion that everything is political leads us to the end result where these people will legitimately say some of the most racist things you will see on the internet, and doing so while believing themselves to be the morally righteous of our society.
Examples? Because yes, while in order to spot dog whistles and political statements, you do need to know how bigots of all stripes think. By learning those thought patterns, it also helps identify them in yourself, but it also helps you identify them in other things so you can defend against it. This idea that you don't need to learn how racists think, how bigots or anti-Semites or homophobes or transphobes or whatever think, lets them get away with being subtle and dog whistling. It's part of this obsession with the aesthetics of racism. It doesn't matter that you think black people are lesser as long as you don't call them the N-word. It doesn't matter that you think gay people are gross as long as you don't call them the F slur. It doesn't matter if you think trans people are gross as long as you don't call them the T slur. This is the aesthetics of bigotry that a lot of liberals focus on and let actual bigotry slide because it doesn't use those aesthetics.
Society, little aware of the fact that they've actually become part of the so-called problem. So not only do the arguments in Salamander's video fall completely flat because the Imperium of Man is not fascist or National Socialist, but it also turns out that the very ideology of social justice being promoted by Salamander and Sigmarxism as a whole is not only fundamentally broken, but actively detrimental to its own cause. Now I do have to admit that this video has actually turned out a fair bit longer than originally intended, but I believe in order to properly and thoroughly respond to Salamander's video, it is absolutely essential to point out the flaws of the ideology that he promotes, at least in terms of how it relates to this particular topic, and just as importantly, how it debunks the entire premise of his video from both a logical and moral standpoint. Now, when I actually put up a poll to determine whether or not you guys would actually like to see
this video is 10 minutes long, which means that it's just long enough to get a pre-roll and a post-roll ad, assuming he's monetized. So all you've done here is be like, no, it's not fascist. In fact, you're the real fascist because Marxism is authoritarian. And your identifying of these fascist stereotypes are indicative of your being fascist yourself. Like, come on, dude. You're not making the arguments you think you are. You're just wrong here. And if you think that did I miss it? Did he debunk the xenophobia of the Imperium of Man? Did I blink and miss that? Because that's a big part of fascism and a big part of the Imperium of Man.
see this video, I will admit that even though I ultimately decided to make this video, I can at least sympathize with the people who said no, and their reasoning. I think it is indeed safe to say that by making this video, Salamander's voice will be more widely heard. However, I would also like to say that this is likely within our best interest, as it is my opinion that the absolute best way to essentially red pill people on the ideology of social justice is to let them have access to the most extreme elements within it.
Red pill has become completely meaningless. It was originally used, as most people no doubt know by now, red pill was initially used to mean someone opening their eyes and learning the truth about the world, and specifically co-opted by the men's rights advocacy groups to talk about someone who had realized that men were marginalized in our society and that needs to change. Whereas it's now become basically just learn the truth about anything. Red pill has no meaning anymore.
And let them see for themselves the utter insanity that is almost always the end result. It is my opinion that people don't usually get red-pilled by individuals such as Arch. Instead, I would argue that it is primarily woke culture that brings people to the light of the truth behind political correctness. Now, I am of course going to be providing links in the description below to both Arch Warhammer's video on whether or not the Imperium of Man is fascist, as well as Salamander's video. Personally, I would recommend against commenting on Salamander's video, and I certainly have to say do not harass or threaten this individual, but if you do insist on commenting, then I cannot stop you. In any case, this has been Ace.
This is stochastic, not quite terrorism, but stochastic harassment. Do not comment, but if you want to, I can't stop you. Okay, dude. Oh boy. The lengths that they will go to try to demonize anyone trying to improve this world. And by they, I mean fascists. And lionize anyone trying to promote fascism is fucking disgusting. Fuck this guy. Hey, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the show. Remember to like, share, and leave a comment because it helps me. Subscribe and ring that bell to help you. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.